positive money bourgeois. And you just have done a bunch of research here recently regarding positive money. Can you break this down for us?
Let me say that I'm trying to finish up with a co-author an extended study of what positive money is, and it's actually very difficult to pin it down because the people who are promoting positive money, for the most part, are not out of academic economics. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be an academic economist to have a good idea. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that it's very hard to figure out, what theory is behind what they're stating, and then also to try to fit their statements into accounting. Okay, we're talking about one kind of accounting, sectoral balance accounting, to make sure that what they're saying is actually coherent. There's another kind of accounting, which is just the normal balance sheets of banks, the central bank, the treasury, trying to run all of this through balance sheets to see, is it coherent? Does it make any sense? And the problem is they haven't done it, and I'm not sure that they're capable of doing it. So you have to try to reconstruct what must be a coherent way of presenting what they're presenting in a non-coherent way. So that's what we've been trying to do. And I would say a lot of it is not coherent. It really, the balance sheets don't balance. Okay, so they're saying a lot of nonsensical things that just aren't possible. You can't do this. That said, and I think you mentioned this, we agree that the banks are completely run away. There's just so much excess, so much fraudulent behavior, too big to fail. They engaged in risky and fraudulent practices before the crisis. The Fed and Treasury bailed them out, patted them on their little behinds and said, go back to doing what you've been doing because you've been doing such a great job. This has to be stopped. So they're absolutely right about that. We want to constrain the banks too. They think that they can constrain them by making them narrow banks. Some of the proponents of positive money, of what's called narrow banking or full reserve banking or 100% money banking, they want to prohibit the banks from just creating money out of thin air. Now, remember what I said before. Hyman Minsky said anyone can create money. All you have to do is write, I owe you $5. How are you going to prevent that? You can't prevent people or institutions from creating money. So what they're going to do is take a part of the financial system, say the commercial banks, and tell them that they can't make loans. Okay, well, you could do that. Is that going to constrain the financial system? No, it's not. Because most of our problems were in the shadow banks anyway. They were not in the commercial banks. Now, the commercial banks are tied to the shadow banks, that is true. And you could take some of the commercial banks, separate them, say you can't do any business whatsoever with shadow banks. Okay, fine, you'll make them safer. But you still have the shadow banking system. They will crash us again. They are bigger than they were in 2007. They are just as interlinked as they were, and they're engaged in, for the most part, the same kind of crazy activities. Outside of the mortgage-backed securities, everything else has returned. And things like auto-related debt is actually much worse than it was in 2007. Student loan debt, much worse than it was in 2007. So we've got all the makings of another crash, and just taking part of the banking system, making them really safe, is not going to protect that at all. The other thing that positive money shares with what in the U.S. is called greenbackers, they say that right now the government has to borrow from the private banks and pay them interest, and They think this is, in some ways, is immoral, that the government is paying interest to private bankers when it could just print money. Okay, and so what they want to do is have the government just print the money to make the payments. Okay, well, do they literally mean that we're going to move to a completely cash-based economy? When the government wants to order a $4 billion bomber, it's going to deliver wheelbarrows of printed up to Boeing or something? I mean, that would be pretty crazy. I hope that's not what they mean. It's hard to tell because they never give us the balance sheets. Or do they mean it's going to be an electronic money? Well, if it's electronic money, that's the way we already do it. The bond sales to the banks are not a borrowing operation. They have to do with monetary policy. We didn't get into that. But that's all about hitting your interest rate targets. It has nothing to do with the government needs bank money to make payments, because all government payments are made by the government's bank, which is called the Fed. It has nothing to do with the private banks, except that you and I have accounts at the private banks. And so when the government wants to pay us our Social Security, the Fed is going to have to make the payment to our private bank for the Treasury. So our private banks are involved that way. It's not that the government needs our bank's money, it's that it has to make payments to us in bank money, so it runs through the Fed to our private banks. So they completely misunderstand how the government spends, and the reality is it already does what they want. Except without delivering the wheelbarrows. It does it all electronically.